everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Unscripted Podcast. I'm Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host. I am delighted that you would take the time out to be with me today. I am on the backside of just finishing a silent retreat with a group of young people that was very moving and very powerful, I believe. And then I'm sitting right on the threshold of another pivotal moment, at least in my life, and that is bright and early tomorrow morning. And I am recording this episode, or this episode on May 21st, and tomorrow morning at 7:30, I will go under the knife and come out with a brand new knee. Now, it's kind of a standing joke that I am something of a cyborg, partly because I run around with a battery in my hip and neurostimulators in my head just to manage the pain in my head. And so I get to add to my hardware, except now this is going to be in my knee. And it is a familiar but unfamiliar place. The last time I was having any kind of knee surgery or leg surgery at all was after an accident I had almost 20 years ago now, where I fractured my femur, and they were working on my leg at that point in time, and I didn't really know that it was happening until it was already over. This one's different because I'm literally walking in and walking out with a new prosthetic knee, which will be weird to say the least, but at the same time, much needed. I have been hobbling around here for quite some time, and so I replace one pain with another with the hope that the pain ends up going away, which is the very segue that brings me into the podcast. Unscripted is, as the name implies, an opportunity for me to reflect on the week and the common things that I see that I think applies to most of us as we walk this journey of life with the important people in our lives and all that goes into it. It was prompted ultimately, like I mentioned, when I started it up, was to actually engage a conversation or spend some time reflecting on my own experience through sorrow after a good friend of mine died in March. And so one of the things that I think caught my attention over the weekend was really the subject of the podcast, and that is, as I have subtitled it, The Collected Wisdom of Life, Living, and Sorrow, and just how much of the subtext of our lives are sorrow, loss, grief, a variety of things that are related to changes in our status. They're desired changes. I mean, a student graduating and going into the next chapter of their lives is a good thing. But somehow we get this notion that a good thing should never have any shadow in it or shadow to it at all. And that doesn't reflect the life that we lead. And that same thing is true. It's very obvious, I think, with events and things of that sort that occur in our lives that are clearly losses or sorrow, that has sorrow connected to it, or mourning. And that's pretty obvious to some degree. Now, that doesn't minimize it or even simplify it, but it's kind of obvious when significant people in our lives die. Then sorrow is the next coming stage, if you will, of what we're experiencing. And that's understandable. That is, and there's a lot of our emotions, it seems to me at least, that are very much calibrated against what would be consistent or understandable with the situation we're in. when we have emotions that do not match the stage that we're in or we're going through, then somehow we find a way to either deny it or distort it or minimize it or dilute it or any number of things just to manage and contain the happiness level, if you will. There's a happiness meter around that. And so we never really, for example, let me just give you an example. People that get married, there's the ecstasy and the excitement and the joy and all of that really goes into getting married. And that's all good. That's wonderful. But there's a shadow there because each person leaves their family of origin. Now, there are plenty of people out there that leave the family of origin and kind of brush off the dust from their feet and say, good riddance, I'm out of that family, now I get to create my own. The worst part about it is that we end up creating the very thing that we come from because we have not spent any time looking at the effects of the family we come from and that which we carry with us into this newly formulated or formed family. So the same thing is true with events like a wedding. There's all the joy and everything else, and then you walk over this threshold, and now, quote unquote, real life begins. Now, real life began far before that moment in time, which means that essentially we have these rituals and things like that are highlight or contrast the nature of what we're talking about here. They seem to make it very, very clear. So commencement and graduation would be an example, or marriage, or the birth of a child, or the loss of a friend, or a loss of a dad, or a mom, or a spouse, or you can just simply go down the list, right? And those, it seems like they are a moment in time that captures and highlights, and you see it in very, very stark contrast, and you're not really sure what you're supposed to feel, which basically implies that I figure out how I feel. I figure out how I feel based on what other people tell me or what social convention tells me or any number of things. And I think that excuse me, I think that plays into even our sorrow, because we are constantly reading the room. We are constantly reading our audience, and we're trying to figure out, is what I'm feeling, is what I'm thinking, is it okay, to put it simply. And you might add the word approved of or any other kind of descriptor that would fit with the people that we're talking to. And what it essentially does is it ends up stealing the ability to be authentic about where we are, rather than what people dictate to us as far as where we quote should be, quote unquote, should be. Because the should be doesn't exist. The should be doesn't exist. Now I can make something be a goal, or make something be something that I'm trying to achieve, and that's okay. That there's something to be said for a goal. If you shoot for nothing, you're sure to hit it. So we need to have something to strive for. But the only caveat to all of that is that if I'm going to have other people dictate to me how I'm feeling and what is socially appropriate and what the social conventions say I'm supposed to do or feel, then I don't even take the time to reflect on what is it I actually feel. And that's sad. I mean, it really is. It's grief upon grief in some respects, because we spend our time trying to figure out what's the right way to feel about the loss we have. And so it steals our freedom. Excuse me. It steals our freedom because it has other people being in charge of what we're actually feeling. But why do we do that? And there are a few episodes ago I spent talking about, and maybe not in this, but in the Outpost podcast, that we do that to remain connected to people. So we see our emotions and the things that we experience as threats to our connection to people. And so we will soften it and tamp it down and repackage it and add a few Christian phrases to make it sound appropriate. And then people won't leave us. Now, there's another side to that. It's really kind of darker side. And the darker side to it is that what about us leaving us? And that's a key, I think, to pay attention to here. And that is that we look at our own emotions as a threat to belonging. And if that's the case, then our own wiring and our own natural self, if you want to put it that way, is a threat to my ability to belong with other people. And if that's the case, then generally I will always choose to be connected to people over being fully who I am. Now, let me take a drink of water here real quick, and then we'll keep going. Okay, I'm back. So there's a key here that I think we have to pay attention to. And that key is how do we balance, if you will. And I really don't like the phrase balance because it implies a static state that everything is in balance. And since when ever in our lives do we ever find balance? It's always moving. So when I hear somebody say, I need to have these things in balance, then essentially we end up settling for a static life, which is not us. And so we don't contend with the full measure of who we really are as humans, and that is dynamic and changing all the time. So the issue isn't balance. The issue is that, if you want to put it another way, you could call it the tension of opposites. Is they're living in that tension, and the problem with tension is that it robs us of certainty, which we have equated with stability, and that's not always the case. Just because I am certain of something doesn't mean that it's stable. Now, let me add one other aspect to it, and then I'll get back to what I was talking about before, is that stability and safety is one of our highest values, whether we recognize it or not. We like things being the same, and we like things being safe, where we don't feel under threat or feel threatened by the people in the world that we live in. So we do whatever we can to make it as stable and as secure and as predictable as we possibly can. And that, while that is very natural of us to do, it robs us of the very thing that adds depth and richness to our relationships. We're trying to create relationships that are risk-free. That is an impossibility. If we expect to also have relationships that have connection and belonging and a sense of purpose to them, then we're always going to be living on the edge of risk, because risk and trust always go together. Trust and control are arch enemies of one another. And so getting certainty and stability and predictability and comfort requires control. Finding richness and meaning and purpose requires trust. And we're not real hot to trot on that idea. So back to my previous point. If we are not going to be authentic with where we are and how we feel in the face of the changes of our lives, I'm not going to say loss specifically, but every change in our lives represents a loss. We let go of one thing and we grab on to another, and there's a sense of loss. And we do this kind of cost-benefit analysis sort of thing and say, well, there's more benefit over here to grasping the change than there is to the cost. But there is still a cost. Cost is never zero. Not in the world that we live in. It is never zero. And so given that fact, then we try to cover over or remove the cost so that it's so minimized that we don't even pay attention to it. The problem with that approach is that it's still there even though we've papered over it. And given that fact, then it impacts my relationships. It does what I call leaks into the relationship and emotional aspects of it. Because we're always living on this risk, or we're always living with a cost that we shouldn't, quote unquote, shouldn't have to pay. But that is not the realism of where we are and the reality of where we are. So if I see my emotions, particularly when I'm experiencing sorrow and loss, if I see my emotions as a threat to my belonging, I will inevitably and consistently bury them. And bury them is probably the best way to put it. And I would point people back to the example that I have given in other podcasts, and I don't know if I've said it on this one, but the example is this little community outside of Niagara Falls that was called Love Canal, and it was literally a canal that started by the state of New York trying to get around Niagara Falls to increase trade and be able to give the surrounding areas financial stability. And the state of New York ended up running out of money, and it was a canal. So it was not lead. I don't think it was lead lined. It was concrete lined, and they essentially just covered it over. They just actually what they did was, since it was concrete lined, they contracted with a biohazard company and a hazardous waste company and put a bunch of 55-gallon drums down in it, and then they covered it all over with dirt and gravel and everything else. And here we go. We have this wonderful tract of land that is all set and ready to roll for people to move into, which is essentially what they did. And so they created this little developed community called Love Canal, and it was over where the former Love Canal was. And lo and behold, to everyone's surprise, which strains my sense of belief, the 55-gallon drums broke open. They leaked into the water table and poisoned people, and they ended up with all forms of cancer and leukemia, childhood leukemia, and birth defects and miscarriages and all manner of health impacts from that hazardous waste leaking into the water table. Now, what does that have to do with what we're talking about here? Because when we take our emotions and we bury them in an effort to maintain what we perceive the connection to others are, they will be buried, and for a time they will look very good. The problem is during that time, they are slowly but surely leaking their way into our emotional water table. And that shows up in our relationships and how we handle our emotions. We tend to get even more iron-handed about it, and we just button everything down. And sooner or later, because life is the way it is, another loss comes along, or another significant change comes along, or a crisis comes along, and it shows itself. It shows itself with, just like it did in the past with Love Canal, in all of the health problems that arose as a result of it. But this time it shows itself in our relationships, with the way our relationships are constructed and what's going on in them. And our emotional regulation, our emotional ownership, and our emotional kind of consistency or even authenticity is under attack. It's just not working. It's not under attack. So all that to say, loss is the subtext of our lives as humans. If we try to cover that over, we're covering over the most essential part of our humanity, because we were designed to be connected to people. And when I say connected, I don't mean dependent. Of course, we start out dependent at the beginning of our lives, and we end our lives in a dependent state. But in between, we don't need people any less. And that's a key element to this connection piece, and our ability and willingness to be known as we are rather than how we should be, because then when people love us, they're loving what we should be instead of who we are, and we can so simply discount that and say that, well, they don't really mean it because they don't really know me. And see, this is a double bind of global proportions, because if they knew me, they would hate me. So therefore, I'm in a really rough state. Then, if they don't know me, I'm disconnected, and I'm still in a difficult state. That's what a double bind is. We're accustomed to hearing damned if you do and damned if you don't. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here, except in emotional connection to people. So what's the solution, you ask, I'm sure, at some point in time? And the solution takes us into the very thing we hate. And that's why people don't look for it, a solution. They just live in the double bind. And we wonder why this is oftentimes referred to as the age of anxiety, because I think that's connected to it. We live in this constant angst of the double bind that's always there. Now, there is a way to solve the double bind, and that is to make a decision about which way we choose to live our lives. Either it's for other people, or it's being authentic as we are and allowing people the freedom to choose. And if they choose against us, yes, it hurts, it's awful, it is terrible. There's a period of mourning and sorrow over the loss of a friendship. At the same time, when people choose us and choose to be in relationship with us, we know that it's the real thing, because they're choosing the real thing. And that same thing goes into our process of handling and experiencing our grief and our sorrow. There is no time, as I said before, there's no time in our existence where we are more human than when we're mourning, when we are experiencing this sorrow, because it's a connection to people, and that connection is connected into the way we were designed, and I would go so far as it's connected to the very soul of God and how He designed us, because He designed us to reflect Him, and that connection is very much a part of that. And so that's where I think, to some degree, I will leave you at the end of this short monologue about life and living and sorrow. It's all connected. that's the one thing I will walk away with from that silent retreat I just finished, is that there were so many stories told about the sorrow of leaving behind one thing to embrace another. And I don't think we necessarily identified it as sorrow and grief, but that's what it is. It is a constant drumbeat, if you will, of our existence as humans. You add to it the existence of being a broken human with broken emotional DNA and connection to people, and that adds in an almost certainty for the sorrow that we will feel, because human relationships are complicated, they're hard, they take a lot of work, and when they fail, then we feel like we have failed or we are lost and we have been abandoned. And that's a bigger topic even in psychology that I won't bore you with. So what does that mean ultimately for us? What it means for us is that's the choice we have to make. Are we going to be true to what we're actually feeling and allow people the freedom to choose how to respond? And what we might find is that in our effort to choose authenticity, to choose being consistent and clear in our revelation, if you will, of who we are, we might actually give other people the invitation and, may I say, the courage to do the same. And guess what happens? The roots grow deeper and deeper in our relationship to one another, and that's the point. The only caveat and the only caution is the deeper those roots run, sooner or later, somebody is going to leave. And that's exactly what we tend to hedge our bets against, is somebody leaving. But the roots are still there, and the roots are life-giving and life-fulfilling. And I don't think anybody that you talk to, when they come to the end of their lives, says, boy, I'm thankful that I hedged my bets about involving myself and immersing myself in significant relationships in my life. You won't hear it. As Paul Zongas, a former congressman from Massachusetts, once said, and he was struggling with his own issues of cancer, and he said, no man on his dying bed will ever say, I wished I spent more time at work. And that's, do the translation for whatever we tend to be drawn to. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. You've been listening to the Unscripted Podcast with Dr. Ray Mitsch. If you are moved by some of what I talk about, we can always use your partnership in supporting the goals of SGI, Stained Glass International. You can do that and find that on the website at sgi-net.org. And there is a donate button, and there are efforts afoot, if we could get the manpower and the financial funding to make it happen, to do other retreats, and maybe do other retreats that are focused on particular life topics, if you will. So changes in life status and grief and loss, and moving deeper into a life of grace and meaning. So all of those are percolating in the background. We always covet your prayers, not only for doing the retreats that I do, but also just the financial funding necessary to keep an organization like this afloat in times where there's all sorts of competition for where you're going to choose to support and, from a spiritual perspective, align yourselves with. And for that, I am eternally grateful for any kind of support that we gain along those lines. So you can donate there as well. There's a lot of other resources that with this summer coming up, and I'm going to be pretty much sidelined, but that doesn't mean that I'm doing nothing. I will be bolstering and broadening and expanding some of the offerings of the things that you will find on the SGI website in terms of free resources and some courses. Lord willing, in the Creek Don't Rise, there will be a e-course before the summer is out on shame and grace. It will give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about those two major topics in our lives that are always there and have a direct impact on our journey through sorrow, otherwise known as the journey through life. So thanks again for joining me. I'll catch you next time. Love ya. Later. Bye.